I'm Heath Lambert, and you're listening to Marked by Grace, a podcast applying the grace of Jesus to all of life. Should Christians take communion outside of their church, outside of their church body, outside of a meeting of their church communion? That is the question that we're going to address on this episode of Marked by Grace. It is a question that one of you sent in. We are not able to do the podcast unless you send in your questions, and so I want to be sure to invite you to do that at markedbygrace@fbcjax.com. That's markedbygrace@fbcjax.com. It's FBC Jax with an X. I would love to get your questions, and I will answer as many of them as I can. And the question this week about whether we should take communion outside of the church is a really great question and is actually a really relevant question because we are faced with so many opportunities out there to take communion in various and sundry contexts. I remember it was over 20 years ago now when Lauren and I were engaged and we were planning our wedding celebration, our marriage service, and one of the questions that we had to address with the people who were helping us plan it is whether we were going to take communion during the ceremony. We had several friends and relatives who were getting married at the same time, and it was kind of a thing that in those marriage ceremonies that they were planning to take communion. Some of them were going to have a communion service for everybody who was there. Some of them were planning to just take communion together as a married couple and as a symbol of their union. And the question was, were we going to do that? Marriages are one context where people are tempted to take communion outside of a church service. There are other contexts, can't address all of those. The question that's come in for this week is just the general question: is that something we should do, or should we restrict the taking of communion to a church service? Well, if you are thinking about taking communion outside of the church, you need to know that that is something that we have no biblical warrant to do. That's a practice, that's an idea that is just foreign to the Scriptures. It's foreign to the New Testament. With regard to communion, that is a practice, it's an ordinance of the church. That is something that the church does, and it is, of course, initiated by Jesus with his disciples, with his followers in the upper room on the night before his death. It's initiated by Jesus. And we actually might have a lot of questions about what that means and what to do with it, except that in the Bible, we don't have just the description of the initiation of the practice, but we have instructions about how to do it given to us from the Apostle Paul. We actually have a lengthy set of instructions in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, starting in verse 17. And I'm not going to read that whole section of Scripture that goes all the way down to the end of chapter 11. But what I'm going to do is just highlight for you the fact that this is a practice in the mind of the Apostle Paul that happens together with the church. This is something that the church does when they come together. It's all throughout the context. Just a few examples. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 17, he says to the church, to the Corinthian church, he talks about when you come together. In verse 18, he says, when you come together as a church. In verse 20, he says, when you come together. In verse 22, he talks about this practice happening as a practice of the church of God. And then down in verse 33 again, it says, when you come together. So he's addressing the church at Corinth. He's talking about the practice of the Lord's Supper, and he says repeatedly, when you come together, when you come together, when you come together as the church. This is not something we do individually. It's not a part of a marriage ceremony. This is something that happens when the church is together. And the reason that is the case is because of what is happening. In chapter 11, verse 24, Jesus says we're supposed to do this in remembrance of me. In verse 25, it says we're supposed to do this as often as you drink it, talking about the fruit of the vine. We're supposed to do it in remembrance of me. In verse 26, it says you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. What we have in the Lord's Supper is a community of disciples coming together and proclaiming the Lord's death. This is something that happens in remembrance of Jesus. That's why we only ever see it practiced in a company of disciples, in a gathering of disciples, and in a gathering of the local church. There are times when it might be tempting to practice this in another way. But the reality is we have no other instruction in the Bible except that this is supposed to happen in the community of believers in the local church. I mentioned to you that over 20 years ago, we had this burden of this question of whether we were going to celebrate the Lord's Supper at our wedding ceremony. And based on this reality, we decided, hey, marriages are great, and the practice of the Lord's Supper is great, but those two things don't need to go together. And so we decided we'll have our marriage be one thing, and we'll have the Lord's Supper be another thing. And we decided, based on the teaching of Scripture, that that's not something that we should do. I'm not condemning my family and my friends who decided to do it. I'm not saying you're a terrible person if you did it. This is not one of those first order issues in the Bible. But it is to say that the same scriptures which teach the practice of the Lord's Supper should define the parameters of how it is practiced. And when you let the scriptures do that, you will have to conclude that celebrating the Lord's Supper outside of your local church is a practice that is foreign to the New Testament.